Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and I'm taking care of business. Joining me today is Franco Terrazzano, who is the Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Franco, you folks have been running a petition lately about defunding the CBC and ending the media bailout. Let's talk first of all about why you as a federation launched this petition.
Well, we think that taxpayers should not be forced to fund media organizations through the government. We think that all Canadians should be able to voluntarily choose which media organizations that we want to fund with our own money. So that is the fundamental reason why we launched the petition.
Okay, what's the response been?
Oh, we've seen a ton of signatures. So we've only launched it less than 2 weeks ago. Within a week, we collected more than 50,000 signatures, more than 50,000 petition signatures in a week. So Mario, to me, that sends a strong signal that this is an issue that many Canadians deeply care about and agree that as taxpayers, we should have to fund media organizations. We should be allowed to keep more money in our own pockets and choose which organizations we want to support.
So let's talk, first of all, about the CBC itself.
Right.
What is that costing the Canadian taxpayers to fund that broadcaster?
It's a huge cost. And that's another reason why we launched this petition and why we're doing this campaign. It's because it's about $1.4 billion now every single year that the government is giving to the CBC. So, I mean, just over a decade, that's more than $10 billion if we're already more than $1 billion a year. So it's a huge cost. And of course, we have to remember just the context that we're in right now. The federal government is more than $1 trillion in debt. It needs to find savings to avoid future tax hikes. And we think that nearly $1.4 billion per year that's going to the CBC is a perfect spot for the federal government to find some savings.
Okay. And what do you say to those people, though, that say, well, we need something like a CBC, a public broadcaster, to give us the Canadian content that we may not be getting, or the Canadian context to news and to other things in life in general? What do you say to those people that we need something like that?
Well, first I would question why it needs to cost $1.4 billion every single year. So even if we take that argument, even if we were to agree with it, I think we'd have to ask, well, why does it have to be $1.4 billion every single year? That's a huge sum of money. The second thing that I need to point out is that we're just calling on the government to defund the CBC, which means just stop giving the CBC taxpayers money. That doesn't mean abolish the CBC, right? So looking at the last annual report, we found that according to the report, that they get about $500 million in revenue, not from the taxpayer. $500 million. So who knows what would happen to that revenue after government funding left? But what we're seeing is that they are raising money not from the taxpayer as well. So we're not saying abolish the CBC, we're saying defund the CBC. Another thing that we have to point out is that this state broadcaster is directly competing with other news organizations here in Canada. Right? So if Canadians want to see news content, which of course we do, we should be able to voluntarily support other or whatever news organizations we want to. It's not fair for news outlets that do not want to receive government funding, that do not receive government funding, to have to compete with an organization like the CBC that's bringing in $1.4 billion annually from the taxpayer.
Let's talk a little bit about the other aspect of this petition is the ending the media bailout. Of course, we know that in recent years, the federal government has come to the aid of the media industry to basically keep it alive. And one of the biggest recipients of cash from the government is Post Media. And full disclosure, I worked for Post Media, before being laid off a few years ago. But how much money is going out in that direction in general from the media bailout perspective?
It's another big sum of money from the taxpayer. It was first introduced in budget 2019, and it's about $600 million. So another huge sum of money. And I think one thing that we have to remember is that in a strong functioning democracy, one of the crucial pillars is an independent media, both in practice but also in perception. And at least you might have heard this, but what I hear talking to a lot of Canadians is that there is a perception that if the government is funding the media, then it dilutes the independence of the media. Now, I'm not saying that's what happens in practice. I'm just saying that that is a perception issue. And in a democracy, the independent press, both practice and perception, needs to be there.
You know what, that brings up an excellent point, because it's funny, because just yesterday I was having a discussion with a president and CEO of a company, a real estate company, just about this very topic, right? He knew my background. You know, I've been 40 years in the industry, yeah, and 35 of it with a major daily newspaper chain. But he wondered about the bias in the media and all that stuff. Do you think that there's more and more of that sentiment from the public out there now, that whether it's a CBC or whether it's other mainstream media, that they're sensing, and you know, whether it's true or not, but they're sensing a bias in the media? So yeah, defunding and ending media bailouts for them would be a no-brainer, right?
Yeah, you know, I do think that perception is there in the public, at least from what my conversations over the last few years, it seems like that perception is really growing among the public, which is, I mean, it's obviously harmful for the journalists too within the industry, right? But this is why we're really pushing for the government to defund the CBC, to end the media bailout. It's also not fair for the other news outlets, the other journalists who are working for, let's call it the independent media, if you will, who are competing, right? Who are competing with these organizations that are getting a ton of taxpayer cash. It's not fair for struggling taxpayers to have to forcibly pay those subsidies through the government. And it's also not fair for the independent news outlets.
So what do you say, again, you know, similar question to what I asked about CBC, but what do you say about, you know, the people say, well, if the bailout wasn't there, you know, a lot of these daily newspapers across the country, some of the, you know, in the bigger cities, would be done and gone. You know, should it be just a survival of the fittest and move on?
Well, it's tough to talk about hypotheticals because we don't know what would have happened, but we're already seeing in the, let's call it broader media landscape, a whole bunch of new innovative type of journalists, type of news outlets that are popping up. So who knows what would happen? And again, what we would say is, remember, it's not like the government is just creating this new money that it's using for the media subsidy out of thin air. Right? That money has to come from taxpayers one way or another. So again, what we're saying is just leave the money in taxpayers' pockets and let taxpayers decide which organizations we want to support with their own money. Canadians want the news. Canadians want Canadian news. So just let us choose which organizations that we want to fund.
And one last thing, just about Petition itself, Franco. So where will this petition end up, and where will you be sending it to?
Well, okay, so that's a great question. Just want to reiterate, within the first week of us launching that petition, more than 50,000 signatures. So clearly this is an important issue for many Canadians. But there's two things that we're going to be using with the petition. Whenever we get a lot of petition signatures, big petition signatures, we will do a delivery. So we'll have to see how many signatures it ends up collecting, and we'll go from there. So that's number one, the obvious. But number two, we ask Canadians who care about this issue to sign the petition so that we can contact them and let them know when we're doing different types of advocacy initiatives so that they can get involved in the issue that they care about.
Okay, and where can they find the petition?
Well, head over to taxpayer.com. There's a petition tab right there. Just click on the tab at taxpayer.com and you'll see the petition.
All right. Thanks, Franco, for joining us again today.
Hey, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right. That was Franco Terrazzano, who is Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'm Mario Toneguzzi. This has been Taking Care of Business. Thanks for joining us today.